It's the PhD weekly log, week 16. So, after the chaos of last week and the reformation of the research question, we are starting to make some progress here. So, yeah, there's been an awful lot of rethinking and trying to clarify exactly what the direction is going forward. So, there's been a week. It's probably going to take a little longer than that, but I do have until August with confirmation. So, I'm beginning to see the value of that procedure. So the scope, bringing it right back down. What I'm beginning to appreciate here is the need for specificity. I mean, like extreme specificity. So yeah, everyone who knows anything about PhDs is probably laughing at this right now, but I have to learn this somehow, apparently. So multiple times, apparently. So let's break this down. We have paired this right back. We're no longer, I think in the last video, I was talking about using a single intervention that we deploy to measure the effectiveness of the ethical framework. Unfortunately, fortunately, on the Monday, I had a little realization that that won't actually tell us anything about the performance of the ethical framework. The ethical framework gives the go-ahead to an intervention. The intervention being tested will only tell us the effectiveness of that intervention, not whether or not it was a good idea to deploy it in the first place in principle. So, refining the scope even further, had a sit down with Matteo, but also Stuart, my additional supervisor over here in the UK, and had a bit of a run at that with both of them. And where we have landed is a bunch of variables that are going to have to be narrowed down. So, first and foremost, the primary output of this PhD is an ethical framework that will allow slash prohibit the intervention into extremist speech online in social media as a movement, not just individual acts, but as a movement. That stayed the same. However, we're now not worrying so much about intervening into that because there's a wide variety of interventions available. However, we are going to have to still be even more specific than that. So, started breaking this down. The function of this ethical framework will be to provide a streamlined means for identifying movements that cannot be justified or tolerated on social media. Right. Incidentally, like an hour ago, the news broke that the federal government is um, regulating. What's the term for this? Has basically said that neo-Nazi groups are now criminalized. Yeah, they've been added to the prohibited hate groups in Australia. That was 8 hours ago. So hey, I believe the specific phrasing was that people have raised the fact that they can just change their names, which is exactly what happened in Victoria recently. The neo-Nazi group disbanded and then immediately reformed elsewhere. And the government's point on that is that the criminal threshold will be determined on the fact that the simple thing would be anyone associated with any organization of this nature. Woof. So I won't lie, a lot of this PhD was built around the idea that this was an unregulated group, meaning that you need something more proactive to cope with them. I don't think this changes that. It basically bans the organizations as organizations, but that's not going to stop them getting online and advocating. Especially with the rise of One Nation as the de facto opposition party, at least we'll see how that plays out. But they have previously gone on the record as promoting, as being sympathetic or supportive of those neo-Nazi groups. So I don't think we're out of the woods on this yet. And look, as the German experience illustrated through the literature, banning them outright doesn't work. It's a good step, but it doesn't work. And so there's going to be something more comprehensive here. I could just switch focal groups over to the manosphere. They definitely qualify as an extremist group under the definition. So we'll have to see. I'll talk to Matteo about that. But NSNs were the easy one to go with. I still think that works. But hey, look, ultimately this framework's going to have to apply to any extremist group that passes that threshold. We can use one as a test case, but ultimately it needs to be universalizable, or whatever the word is. It shouldn't be focused on specific groups. It should be apply equally to all groups based on the quality of their conduct. So there's a group. So it's provide a streamlined means for identifying movements that cannot be justified in existing on social media. That then allowing various AI-driven interventions to be applied to a given movement, noting that different types of interventions will be more justified for different contexts. So that does still go back to what I was originally saying, but rather than trying to launch Eight classes of intervention, which come to about 80 different types, and then having to measure and evaluate all of those simultaneously, which I've been informed is about 80 PhDs worth of work. It will be more in reference to what a potential viable response would look like in that context. They can save that for after the PhD and, $200 million worth of funding or whatever the hell. So, what qualities will the framework need to have in that case? It needs to establish a high threshold past which wholesale intervention can be justified. It must be streamlined and it must be practical. We can't just give them a methodology or just an endless list of qualifications. It needs to be something that they can test simply. And who do we mean by they using it? Social media companies and or the state government or federal government potentially in this context now. It must be politically acceptable. That's suddenly gotten a hell of a lot easier. But, One Nation will still push back on this, I suspect. But either way, it needs to be something that will be viable politically. So that the realities there need to be taken into account. It must reflect the capabilities of the AI. So what the AI can and cannot do. If I'm asking it to do something that it flat out cannot do, it's not how the AI works. I'm going to look like an idiot, and it's not going to fly. It must account for all relevant and useful applicable legal frameworks. A lot of like, to be honest, legal frameworks don't really apply to what we're proposing here in a regulatory fashion because the current paradigm is that as long as it doesn't breach hate speech laws or any explicit laws, it's left to the social media companies to determine what they do and do not censor, which is very untransparent. So while the laws aren't going to apply directly, we need to at least show that we've acknowledged them. There's multiple reasons for doing that. One, why wouldn't you? Two, it adds it feeds into that political acceptability in the sense that, yes, the High Court's methodology for determining when it's justified for a law to breach freedom of speech does not have any jurisdiction over what we're building here, but it's a pretty good precedent. It's something we can point at and say, well, the High Court does it this way. So you want to get a good starting point there, make it more acceptable. In other words, it must account for those legal precedents. It doesn't have to mimic them or necessarily abide by them either, but it must account for them. We should show that we know what we're talking about in this space. I should know that I know what I'm talking about in this place. I'm talking about the we. No idea why. Safety in numbers, maybe. Anyway. It must account for the costs and benefits of intervention and seek to maximize the benefit and minimize the harm. So this is your consequentialism, pretty straightforward. The different types of interventions and the intensity of those and who they're targeted at and when it's justifiable to use them, that would go that way. Minimizing the risks associated. So yeah, it must address any real or measurable threats posed by the extremist groups online. It needs to, if we're going to have an AI running here that identifies groups based on their conduct, we need to know what that conduct typically is. And it must be extremely defensible at all stages. Basically, the whole game here is going to be that at the end of it, someone's going to turn around and say, on what basis did you interfere with our communications, our political speech? And we must be able to point at every single point in the reasoning and be like, that why, that's why, that's why, and that's why, all the way down to fundamentals. Shouldn't be a problem. I mean, this is the entire point, but it is critical. There should be no holes. So, once the framework is built, how do we evaluate its effectiveness? Because that is the data, right? First and foremost, it must accurately identify target groups. We can use test cases there. We can also use a human rights reference group to stress test the idea and make sure it doesn't accidentally target the wrong people or victim groups, for example, which has happened before. It must accurately reflect the realities of current and emerging AI functions. So a technical aspect of that must reflect the current and emerging political landscape in the field. So interviews, again, what's taking place, what's emerging out of the thing. I mean, this example of the NSNs just getting banned is a pretty damn good illustration of needing to be across that. It must address known risks proactively and ensure accountability for outcomes. Yeah, now this is the trick. This one's the real trick because just putting a framework out that goes and it does what we intended it to do, or we think it does what we intended it to do. Unless it's measured, unless it's accountable to the actual results, there'll be no way to fix it, and we'll have no idea if we've done a good job, which is exactly where existing regimes for dealing with extremist speech have gone sideways in the past. Establishes internal monitoring and evaluation mechanisms you should apply to evaluate and adjust performance. So yeah, no, it should be baked into the framework. It should just be a matter of, hey, here's the framework. Make sure you evaluate it, figure out how. It should be built in. We should be able to provide them with means, or the users, so social media companies and or the government, means of proactively checking whether or not this is working or not. Reference groups are a good start. Okay, so I mentioned variables for before. So this is where it becomes even more specific than that. It's a question of, okay, but what specifically are we talking about? So, first variable, are we talking about hate speech, extremism, violent extremism, or terrorism? This one we know. We're focusing on extremism. Borderline speech, as it's put. We're not talking about terrorist groups specifically or calls to terrorism. We're not talking about violent extremism necessarily. It doesn't necessarily have to revolve around violence. And most of the existing, like the whole ASIO framework is built around that already. We're not talking about hate speech either because it's too broad, too generalized. We can use that as a measurement that's good for monitoring, but it's too simple, too broad of a target. What we're looking at here is extremism, not necessarily extremism that will lead to violence directly. In fact, as I've mentioned before, it's not the violence that I'm worried about, the tactical violence. It's the strategic violence, the clever plays that get you into power that will then allow you to discriminate on a whole legal scale, which is where the real harm is. So we're using Berger's definition of extremism for that. And if, okay, so second variable, if we're talking about extremism, what definition of extremism? Subsequently, what parameters of extremist group are we talking about here? Berger's definition of extremism is an extremely good starting point because, it's the group must constantly be in conflict with an outer group. There's no victory state. There's just a constant state. You cannot, the group does not exist without the conflict with that outside group. Hence why the manosphere sort of qualifies because they exist in opposition to women, not wanting to take, not even the whole patriarchy, misogynistic thing of wanting to take them back to the 1950s level of rights. No, they exist as conflict with women. There will never be a victory there, right? Because if there was, the group wouldn't need to exist. So then we're going to have to figure out the parameters. What type of AI are we justifying the use of? So you trigger that, it deploys what? So we're talking about Gen AI, agentic, etc. Thinking there is agentic. I've been reading up about it all today in the last couple of days, and as far as we can tell, that is more of a classification of AI rather than a specific type. So there may be a question of which agentic AI are we going to use? Agentic AI is as opposed to generative AI or LLMs are like, how do I phrase this exactly? I'm still learning about it myself. They're autonomous and they're able to be task focused and goal focused goal focused as opposed to task focused. So your Gen AIs were very, very good at doing defined tasks. However, they weren't able to adjust and adapt or combine multiple tasks to accomplish a larger goal. So OpenAI, what is it? ChatGPT is now an agentic AI, is my understanding. So yeah, it's a far more complex, far more competent version of the AI. So we really need to be specific about what type of AI we are suggesting to deploy. We want to suggest one that will most likely be used anyway, so that this all stays current. We want to get outdated by the march of time during the PhD, which is liable to happen anyway. So I'm going to have to stay ahead of the game. Um, yeah, so it may even be then which company's specific version of agentic AI are we going to focus on for this PhD? I need to work on that, clarify that one. What sort of intervention are we aiming for that AI to employ? So that sort of is similar to what we were talking about last week. What do we want them to do? Well, the point of being specific about this is that we can then be really, really clear on the measurables, like really define those ethical parameters in such a way that it becomes like a basis for broader policy, but in the short term, it needs to be incredibly rigorous about what exactly we are suggesting and demonstrating that it will in fact work. I've mentioned counter speech on here before. Empathetic counter speech is a vibe is probably the go-to, my go-to intervention, but I've been thinking about it a little more. Counter speech is reactive by its nature. Um, you wait till someone says stuff online and then you swamp it with or with the counter narrative. Whereas inoculation would allow for a proactive stance. You wouldn't have to wait until it occurs. You just need to find areas that illustrate these sort of narratives, target narratives, and then inoculate proactively. You could even extend it out to recruitment areas or likely areas in much the same way that NSNs tend to use boxing gyms or MMA gyms as recruitment grounds. We would find where they recruit from, and I'm sure there's literature to that end, but the AI would again be very useful in this, and pre-bunk or inoculate the potential recruit groups proactively. Now, this is good because this is not banning. This is not an inhibition of free speech. It's more of a dealing with bad use of free speech with good use of free speech. The fact that it was automated and there was sort of like the tactical carpet bombing of free speech is marginal, but nonetheless, it's still more constructive. So we'd have less problems with it. I think that might be the way to go. And finally, who's the framework for? Who do we want to act based on that framework? I'm thinking that's the social media companies. As I've mentioned before, I'd like this to be owned by the state government, being criminal. Might be federal, considering they've just banned all neo-Nazi groups. On what basis they did that? I suppose it's terrorism, isn't it? Or national security, because criminal matters are state matters. So anyway, I'm sure they've done this in coordination with the states. I doubt there's many state governments that are going to stand up and object to that. So that's where my head's at now. I'm going to pull this into a bit of a presentation, take that to Matteo on Monday, see if I'm headed in the right direction. Yeah, it's been a pretty stressful week, I'm not going to lie. Went in with the head of steam last week, thinking I'm going to deploy this enormous project. It's going to be great. And then, get the reality check, have to shrink down the perspective and then shrink it down again. And no doubt next week we'll have to shrink it down again. I'm starting to get my head around why, though, and the importance of it being so incredibly narrowly focused. So we'll get there. Reading up on AI, agentic AI in the meantime, reading up on, I've been having conversation. Fortunately, as it turns out, I know several people who are very familiar with agentic AI. Thanks for the chat today, Luke. You're a legend. And that's given me some good perspective there too. So coming to understand what it needs and what its limitations are, it's very good at doing tasks from what I understand, like proactively and taking into account all relevant information. The tricks, of course, is that it needs that relevant information and it needs to know where it is. You also need to evaluate. As with all AI, it'll flat out lie to you that it about sources if it has to. It's a people pleaser, right? So it'll just tell you that, yeah, this is the way to do it. Is it? It'll lie like it, well, it's saying so, right? And then even if you point out that it's incorrect, it'll be like, oh, you're dead right. Here's an alternative, and that's wrong too. So human in the loop is essential, obviously. So now the relationship between the ethical framework, the AI, and the intervention it deploys, there is a strong one there in the sense that to deploy that intervention, the AI is going to have to be able to detect the groups that breach. So in some ways, we're not too different from what I brought out last week. It's just we're being very, 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 very specific here. So anyway, the refinement of the scope continues. Going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. Next week's update should be interesting.